All right, thank you so much, Dr. Rogers. If you want to go ahead and take your screen down, if those are all the slides that you have, I'll go ahead and we'll have both you and Dr. Cox come back. And we have some questions that have come in private messages to me that I can go ahead and ask. And so the first one, and I think this is probably a pretty complex question, is flooding increasing in Missouri? So try to think about this in Missouri and not just on the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers, our big rivers, but also on some of the tributaries going into those rivers as well. So is flooding increasing? And then a follow-up to that is how much of that is driven by heavy rains or potentially changing rainfall patterns compared to how rivers are managed?
Well, Amanda, you want to take the first crack at that, or do you want me to?
Yeah, you can go ahead and I'll follow up with any additional information.
Okay. Well, first one we got to start with, when you have floods like the three flood set on the Missouri River in 2019, that had never happened before in historic time. But you have to remember, to know what a 100-year flood is, you would need 1,000 years of record. So it always seems like it's wild and crazy and getting worse, but you have to look at it over a long period of time. We do know that the dams on the Missouri River had an enormous benefit in the 2011 flood by bringing the flood water up and holding it. The big thing that we should have learned in 1927 and 1973 and 1993 is what kills levees is levels going down rapidly. So you'll have a big flood pulse come through and the river will come up. If the river goes down 7 feet in 9 days, the levees just crumble due to rapid drawdown effect. It has to do with the internal pore water pressure in the levee. So you want to bring the flood up and hold it as constant as you can. You don't want the level to fluctuate during the flood season, and then you want to slowly bring it down. 2011 was the first time they used the spillways at Fort Peck and were dumping water in March, way ahead of the flood because of the prognosis that season. So they had much more flood storage there than they had in 1973 or 1993. And they hit the ball out of the park. That was the first time they actually routed the flood and did a great job on it by bringing it up one cycle and taking it down one cycle. And that's what really helps. What you don't want is a flood that comes up and goes down and comes up and goes down. And 2019, that's what we had on the lower Missouri River. And we didn't have enough dam storage area in Missouri to do much because the Missouri River just passes through like a big freight train. We don't have a place to store the water here. You have to store it upstream of Missouri. All right.
Yeah, so I'll just follow up a little bit on that. We have seen a lot of record events in Missouri, but it is difficult to determine exactly the cause of those. River systems, as I mentioned, are dynamic, and it's likely a combination of both changes in precipitation intensities and land use changes. I personally haven't done research in that specific area to tell you what's contributing to what's contributing or if there are increases in flood occurrences in Missouri.
Thank you. Amanda, I think you now should be able to turn back on your video. Let me know if you have any trouble with that. Sorry.
Thank you. That's okay.
So this is a question from a legislator, but they mentioned that there's this ongoing saga of levees and maybe levee breaches in Northeast Missouri, I'm guessing along the Mississippi River. And so maybe this is a question for Dr. Rogers, but what factors go into the levee design and how it's managed? And can we manage them better perhaps in Northeast Missouri so that the flooding does not occur in so much intensity?
Well, Northeast Missouri is some of the oldest levees in the United States. If you go to Quincy, Illinois, the farmers started putting levees in 1843. So those all predate the Corps of Engineers. So they weren't designed by the Corps of Engineers. They're just inherited by the Corps, who keeps heightening them and helping with the funding of heightening them. And so the biggest problems we've had on most of those levees is where we have old channels going underneath the levee. So when the flood stage comes up, the old channels are much more pervious. They get high pressure head, and that goes underneath the levee and comes up on the protected side. And there was one we had up there in 2008 where we had 100 rock and gravel trucks all ready to put around this lake that is a perennial spring that's always there on the protected side of the levee. And that should scare the heck out of you. And they tried everything they knew how to do, and the flood fight still failed. They had one like that in 2011 in Cairo, Illinois. They actually won, and they did around a boil that was 37 feet high. That's an all-time record. And every time we have these things, we learn something, but basically we inherited, something from grandma and grandpa, and where the levee is and the geology underneath it is what's all important and all controlling. The farther you can get that levee away from the low flow channel, the better conditions you're going to encounter with respect to underseepage. And so we were overly greedy on diking off too much of the floodplain. That was really the central problem.
This is so fascinating to me. I'm a soil scientist, and so, I think of soil morphology and the sediment sizes close to the river and far away from the river, and had never thought about it in relation to how we manage the river and put up control structures. But
yeah, clay levees that have any clay in them are much more robust because they have higher cohesion, higher shear strength. Silt is very erodible, like sand. You just put a fire hose on it and it's gone. It doesn't have any cohesion. It's like a marble pile.
Very interesting. So some other questions that are coming in. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and Dr. Cox, I'd like to ask you more specifically about the models that are the predictive models that you're creating, are working on. How much can they predict year to year, or are you looking more generally at flooding events?
Yeah, so they actually do predict year to year. So currently the models are set up to when we say the time stepper will model a condition for one day at a time, but we're modeling annual conditions for, say, a full year, and then we change to the next annual conditions. And so we can use this model. We can model out 50 years or 100 years along the Mississippi River. We're kind of doing, looking at previous conditions right now, looking at conditions between 2004 and 2013, seeing how well our model can recreate those channel changes along the Mississippi River. But yeah, it is year to year, and but kind of broken up day to day, but at the same distribution of flow. So it's really more of a year to year kind of analysis.
If I might ask a follow-up question, is the work that you're doing, is it also applicable to some of the rivers that we have in the southern part of Missouri, where they're more rock bottom rivers that may not have as much sediment flow?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we define our channel conditions, we indicate what type of material is on the bed and then on the banks. And so we can specify that if it's rock material, that it's not erodible. That can be an important feature in many channels that controls the hydraulics and the channel morphology changes. So we can incorporate those types of features into the model and sort of limit at the location along the channel where you have rock features, the ability for the channel to adjust. Okay,
very cool. So a question for Dr. Rogers, what kind of authority does the federal government have versus state and local control for managing rivers, levees, and dikes? And I think maybe both of you might be able to answer this question.
Well, it depends who you're going to get money. It's been one of the problems that the farmers up in like northeastern Missouri will tell you is FEMA will come along during a flood fight and say, we'll give you money to put sandbags on, or we'll give you money to put a barrier wall up on top of the dike to raise it up, 6 feet, 5 feet. But then they don't give you money to take it down. And the feds come along, Corps of Engineers, and they say, you got to take that off there. That was a temporary structure. You can't leave it up there. And so they got paid to put it up, but they don't get paid to pull it back down. So you got to realize these statutes were written over many, many decades, over 75 years. And no one's ever stopped to say, is this still true? Should we make this one consistent with that rule? We didn't even have FEMA back before 1969. So maybe we ought to rethink some of this stuff. So like the one problem I have is they always have to put the dike in just like it was before, and it failed before. So when you take an oath as a professional engineer to have a reasonable factor of safety, in your design, they don't let you do that. They say, nope, you just got to put it back in like it was. There can't be any benefication to it. And that is not in our long-term interest as a state or as a federal perspective. What we're trying to do is to spend money wisely, and we have to incorporate more of these aging effects than we used to. In the old days, we were just building, but we didn't have any examples of these things that had been out there for 100+ years to look at what the aging issues are. And that's when you find out the aging issues, you got to change the way some of the legislation's written to be more in line with what your current thinking is. We have that same problem right now with global warming trends and issues. And one of the things that's really come out of that research that's been valuable is the coefficient of variation, looking at, because that drives people nuts. Why do we have so many floods? Why do we have so many this or that? Well, it's your variation in your precipitation in your tributary basins. That's what creates those kinds of swings. And those swings are what you have to design for. But you look at a place like California, the lower half of California from Sacramento all the way to the Mexican border has the highest coefficient of variation in the world. More than the Sahara Desert, yes. And so 2 out of 3 years in California are dry of average. So 2 out of 3 years you're in drought. So drought is just something you live with there, and try to save as much water as you can in the wet years. But that's one of the things that's come out of all this research. We're trying to look back and say, how do you know that's true, that variation? Well, you got to go back and get tree ring analysis and all kinds of other proxies for getting yourself back at least 500 years to take a look. And that database is continuing to grow all over the country. We use it for testing confirming and testing the size of spillways on major structures. We go back and look at the fluvial geomorphology of the floodplain, and we dig trenches and we try to identify and date past flood events so we can get an idea of what the frequencies really are. And they're never evenly spaced. They always tend, with earthquakes and floods, they tend to come in groups and then have a block of time where nothing happens, and then groups and then a block of time. Now, but for design purposes, we have to pick a number. We don't get to do it in the groups because we don't have enough data to sustain that kind of model usually. Did that answer what you want to know?
I think so. So maybe we'll end on one last question here and then wrap up. So this is a question for both of you. The audience of this briefing is hopefully state legislators, and I know we have a few who are watching right now. what considerations should policymakers consider when thinking about building on floodplains in particular? I know that there's currently legislation that prohibits some infrastructure development on floodplains, and this is something that's probably going to increasingly be considered in the future. So yeah, sorry, what considerations should policymakers consider when thinking about building on floodplains in Missouri?
Yeah, I'll take a start at that. This is a really interesting topic and one of a lot of interest across the nation right now. And one of the emerging areas is called nature-based infrastructure, where we try to allow the river to use more of its floodplain and access that storage. And that benefits the river in a variety of ways, but reducing flooding both upstream and downstream, and just allowing it to have some of its natural flow capacities and abilities to dissipate floods. That's really important. And so when we look at those types of solutions, like allowing the floodplain to flood as opposed to building in it, we look at historical events, and we also look at the economic cost of that. So that's a really critical factor. I think that's one area where there could be more research done in analyzing the economic benefits of these nature-based solutions for infrastructure. And I've heard that as a regional priority and as a national priority throughout the United States. I definitely think there's a lot of value in looking at that. If we look at the costs associated with flooding that occur frequently, having that ability to reduce the flooding along the channel by allowing it access to the floodplain could make a lot of sense. But again, there should be some research to look at the economic impacts of doing that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's one of the things the NAS panel we looked at was, promoting aquaculture. We never should have diked off more than 75% of the nation's floodplains, especially on a major arterial like the Missouri River, which is carrying so much sediment load in addition to just the water load. We need to give back enough room to these rivers so they can function like rivers and not just like, flood control gutters. And so I would agree with that wholeheartedly. You do have some things like Sacramento Airport and Alfred Air Force Base near Omaha that are major infrastructure installations that were built in the floodplain because that's the flattest ground and the easiest place to put airports. And so if you look all over the country, Houston, everywhere, the major airports are in the floodplains. It's not a great place, unless you think about allowing them, you want to allow them to get shut down periodically or portions of them. But what has become interesting on those projects, we were briefed by the Air Force on Alpit, and it's one of the most expensive runway repair installations they have in the country. They do more runway repair there in millions of dollars. So it was made it easy in World War II to build, big, it was a strategic air command headquarters through the Cold War, but long-term sustaining it on those kind of soft, silty soils, prone to flooding and high water table, it's very expensive to maintain pavement for heavy wheel loads in that kind of environment. So we have to look at the whole picture, just like what Amanda was saying. I would agree with that.
I was just reading a paper about runways on floodplains, but I'm thinking of the Jefferson City Airport, which is just right there along the Missouri River floodplain. And
right.
So I'm sure we can all think of some places where that would be relevant. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap up now. Thank you so much, Dr. Rogers and Dr. Cox, for being on this call today. We appreciate having your insight, and hopefully if lawmakers have questions to follow up, we can perhaps send those your way.
Sure, I'd be happy to take them.
Great.
Thank you.
And then I just wanted to wrap up by saying our next briefing is going to be on February 10th, and it'll start at 7:30, and it'll be on education. specifically on college access and completion for historically underserved students. And we've got several speakers lined up from across the state. And our fellow Dr. Brittany Whitley is really excited to host that webinar for lawmakers. So we'll hopefully see you back on February 10th, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.